Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event titled To Buy or Build, the questions surrounding federal IT. My name is Eric Egan. I'm a policy fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. ITIF is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of technology, public policy, and innovation. This webinar is being streamed online and recorded. If you're watching live and would like to submit questions, you can do so through Slido. The link is on the ITIF event page, which has also been shared on social media. The purpose of today's discussion is to revisit a perennial question in federal IT regarding agencies buying or building software. It's a question federal IT leaders will continue to be confronted with, given the rate of change in IT and the landscape of available products. Indeed, we'll likely be exploring today whether the or in the buy or build question is itself outdated, as agencies may look for hybrid solutions, particularly as products become more configurable and modularized and access to open source software expands. One thing is certain, there's a lot of work to be done in federal IT, including ongoing efforts to replace costly legacy systems, migrate to cloud, and advance cybersecurity. And there's ultimately not enough money to go around. Federal IT leaders, contractors, and service providers, therefore, can all use the additional insight and expertise as much additional insight and expertise as possible as they look to address these challenges. Luckily, we have such a group of experts with us today. Suri Durvasula is Vice President of Civilian Agencies for Dell Federal. Ala Seifert leads Public Sector Public Policy at Amazon Web Services and previously served at the General Services Administration, including as a product manager at 18F. And finally, Gordon Bitko is the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council and was formerly the FBI's Chief Information Officer. Welcome all, and thanks for joining. Suri, I'll start with you to set the stage and kind of get some terms defined for us. What's typically meant by a commercial off-the-shelf or COTS product versus a custom product, kind of the buy versus the build in the context of today's discussion?
Yeah, I mean, COTS software is generally product you purchased. It's built by them by a company that has defined the capability, the configurability, and the look and feel of the product, if you will. Whereas custom is software you build for your unique use case. In the past, I don't know if it was always a unique use case, but today, we see a lot of custom build as agencies have specific requirements, whether it's something like waste, fraud, and abuse, maybe something at the edge, where there isn't a commercial product that's available to support that need. Generally, ideas around that are so unique in nature, like subjects that matter to the federal government, are never going to be found in the commercial space, if you will. And so, that's where we tend to see the custom offerings. In the past, custom used to be such a challenging thing, right? You needed so many experts and such capability to be able to develop. But today, with low code, no code, there's so many options and the ability and accessibility for people to participate in custom software build. It's a different market today than it was, several years ago. So, generally, that's where we go. And I don't know if there is an or, if you will. There's definitely an and in today's marketplace, and we see it across the board.
Cool, thanks for that. Would you say there are two or kind of three benefits, or maybe traditionally, and this is something we'll challenge today potentially around, over the last 10 to 20 years, thinking about if it were in an or situation, what would the benefits of maybe a COTS solution versus a custom solution, or what has that dialogue often been around why agencies may have preferred to go one route versus the other?
I think COTS has always been seen as a speed to value type of proposition, right? It's already built. You're implementing what somebody already thought up and putting it out into the marketplace. So generally that's where we've seen the application. Although there's complexity and implementation and all those other components. The other part is supportability, right? You take the accountability off of yourself and the builder of the product, and you put that accountability on the company or organization that's supporting the build of that product, right? And the ongoing maintenance. And so there's value per se in that place. The challenge is, does the product actually meet your need and your outcome that you're driving for? If you're the postal service, are you going to get is the COTS product going to deliver on every part of your mission? given the unique nature of that business, and in reality, there's not many other companies that do what that company does, right? So how do we look at it and say, okay, is this product going to meet my need, and am I going to get my speed to value? If I'm not, then I've got to look at custom in order to hit that target and hit that directive, if you will.
Yeah, and that maybe that's a good segue. I know, so I mentioned 18F in your introduction. Could you briefly explain what that is and kind of some of the work they're doing around the federal government's role in IT shared services?
Sure, absolutely. So 18F, that is 1-8 and the letter F, not to be confused with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Sounds kind of similar. It is a division inside the General Services Administration that, inside the Federal Acquisition Service, rather, at the GSA, that really focuses on innovative contracting and innovative service delivery, sort of guided by the ethos of human centered design, open source, and broadly innovation. The idea was that the GSA is an agency that provides a tremendous amount of shared services already. And sort of in the 2013, 2014 timeframe, this organization was stood up inside the GSA to provide services to other agencies for a fee. And the thinking there was, maybe GSA can be the one that hires developers, designers, full stack, front end, back end, acquisition experts, product people. They bring them in and sort of has a consultancy model where those teams are then able to go out and solve problems and have those fed to fed conversations that that sometimes were a little challenging for government agencies to have if they were dealing with a vendor that they thought was sort of selling something. The thinking was, can we get a bunch of technically talented feds that are really motivated by mission and have them partner with other federal government agencies to have a discussion on what Suri was saying around what the requirements really are, and what does an acquisition strategy look like, and have we talked to end users, and are we really just going to reuse the same procurement docs we used 5 years ago that are 300 pages long and didn't really yield a really good solution? So it's a team of maybe 200 folks, give or take some amount of different job categories that are brought in on term appointments into the GSA to do this really interesting consulting style work.
Very cool. Yeah, and kind of hitting on to what Suri had mentioned around, one of the challenges is certainly Cots solutions have a lot of benefits for kind of traditional or generic kind of back office HR accounting, right? At least when we think of it in broader use in industry. But as Suri mentioned, so many government agencies have very specific missions. And it's certainly that, I think, has been one of the reasons why they think I need something custom. It's really the only way that the post office can do the very unique thing that the post office does. How I guess with that kind of in mind, and from maybe the 18F or the Federal Insider's point of view, when groups like the U.S. Digital Service and 18F are thinking about this question of custom versus COTS, how are they kind of thinking of it maybe differently from a commercial perspective, particularly given the mission critical nature of agencies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one is definitely, to Suri's earlier point about the time to delivery, the time to value, right? Every minute you don't have a system is a potential moment where you are not delivering on mission outcomes for federal agencies, which is really significant. And I think the sort of guiding light and sort of something that guided all of 18F's work was really thinking about the end user and starting from the end user and working backwards and thinking about what are end users of the system really going to need, and how do we arrive at a solution that is going to meet those needs given the complexity of IT compliance and the procurement process, and sort of getting something that is extensible so that it can evolve and ingest APIs at another point in time, and thinking about that on the front end so that whatever solution is ultimately deployed can really meet agency need as opposed to meeting like the PMO's desire to obligate the funding they happen to receive that year, right? And I think it's certainly a balancing act where on the one hand, you've got money, it's it's got a time limit for when it has to be obligated, but on the other hand, you've got users with real needs and users who may, maybe you've got agency field staff that have limited connectivity on their government issued devices. What does an app really need to look like, or what does a piece of software need to look like if it needs to be used in the field? Um, and thinking about the requirements in sort of that holistic way and using human-centered design principles and really focusing on UX and the broader sort of experience of the end users was sort of how 18F began to look at the problem. And the short answer about like buy build, yes, yes, all of the above. And a lot of that has to do with sort of like what does the tech stack for a modern piece of software look like? It's open source components. You get some monitoring, some detection, sort of pieces in the software stack. You build it all in the cloud, and then you got to also get that through security and compliance, which is sort of its own rodeo that requires its own sort of separate set of resources. And so the answer really depended really differently based on the different missions. Sometimes it was as easy as a COTS solution with some configuration, and sometimes it was a new build, and there were different approaches to it. And I think one of the big lessons learned as the 18F as an organization matured was that industry really could rise to meet whatever demand that that the government put in front of it. I think at first in the like sort of post healthcare.gov morass, there was the thinking of like, oh, traditional government contractors, they can't meet mission need. And it's like, well, no, like perhaps the problem was the 300 pages of requirements documents with 78 incorporated contract clauses that were incorrect. And maybe it was the requirements that were set on the vendor that didn't set up the vendor to succeed. And I think one of the things that 18F was really conscious of is after you finish the human-centered design part and you sort of define your requirements, thinking about how those requirements should be articulated in the contract so that you get really good outcomes and that you incentivize vendors to build, if you're doing a build, or configure a COTS solution to get the intended outcomes without being overly prescriptive on how that's done.
Yeah, thanks for that. There was a few things you mentioned there that I might want to tease out and maybe even open it up for the group and large. One is kind of open source software, and really, is there also as a model per software as a service and these other as a service models, and is there really any difference, I suppose, between COTS and open source and SaaS and all of these things and custom? Is it kind of going back to this idea that this buy or build doesn't really exist anymore, or how do folks really think about when they're building a product or a solution? Like, how they kind of pick and choose, and what is that technology landscape? And when you think of a solution, is really, it's not like a thing as much, depending on what the particular initiative. It's often a collection of different things. And I don't even know if this is a question yet, but really just throwing out that.
No, yeah.
Given that, the landscape, what kind of things are agencies and service providers kind of thinking through?
And I'd love the other folks on the panel to speak up on this. I'll just start by saying it's sort of like a spectrum of all of the above. And I think great contracts that are sort of fit for mission purpose allow vendors and the sort of folks to make the right technical choices about the specific pieces of the tech stack that work for the intended outcome. And then those folks are sort of empowered to not just build the thing in whatever configuration set of components, but with the right features, and then get that deployed into production, and then be able to sort of at the risk of bringing another term into this, getting a DevSec model set up so that you're able to then continue to provide additional functionality, fix holes or patch vulnerabilities, what have you, and that you're not in like a quarterly or annual release cycle for sort of new features, right? It's like how do you build the thing and then set it up so that it itself can live on and be successful over time, as opposed to having it static for the next decade. And I feel like Suray's got some thoughts on this. And
No. I totally agree with you, right? We've been talking with agencies across government about building out software centers so that as you build this thing, you continuously iterate on it and keep improving upon it, but also build out talent that understands how it all works so that you don't end up in the historical issues we've had with open source, which is supportability and ongoing maintenance, et cetera. As you keep iterating on it, you can keep it alive, if you will, right? I think oftentimes in the past we would implement open source, it kind of got left in the corner, ran on its own, and somebody forgot about it, and the person who implemented it left, right? And so you have this security issue. Today, I think that model changes as we go into a DevSecOps type of model and build out these software centers to where we can sort of keep it alive and keep it updated and fresh versus having to go through a whole nother iteration starting from scratch.
Eric, if I can jump in on that point as well. And of course, the answer is yeah, it's a spectrum. But I think, Surya, in your comment there, you touched on one of the key points here, which is workforce capacity in the agency. And when you're making these buy-build decisions, you have to think about what's the long-term total cost and total risk to the organization. And that means understanding if we've invested in this, it's a pipeline, we can't stop doing the work. We have to maintain it for security. That ultimately constrains you, right? That's a decision you have to be cognizant of. By doing this and committing these resources here, now I have fewer downstream resources available for some other new need that's going to show up tomorrow. That's going to be the new mission critical thing that the agency has to have built. So I think that the challenge is, and what's implicit on agency leadership is to be cognizant, like I said, of the whole risk and the total workforce capacity, and how do you plan for all of those things when you make these decisions. You can't make any one in a vacuum. You have to think about what's your total capacity. And then one other thing, and of course, I would never disagree with you, but you mentioned security as being yet another thing. And that is one of the problems we have right now in any of this sort of decision-making around buy or build or acquire COTS. And that's thinking about security as this other thing. And that's wrong. You have to, on day one, when you're starting on the product, when you're starting to say, what do we need, be thinking about what are your security requirements from the very beginning. It cannot be this afterthought, or you end up with all the legacy problems, Eric, that you talked about at the beginning. And that's a place where agencies get into a lot of trouble. They add on some security requirements downstream, and then they're struggling to maintain what can frequently become incompatible products, and investing more and more just in maintaining that old legacy infrastructure, because you can't stop doing the security work. It's a critical piece of hardware, software, an application that the agency depends upon. And so you've put yourself in a box when you think that way. And a lot of agencies, unfortunately, they're in that box today where they have fewer degrees of freedom to make choices than they should. And so I think that you have to be able to think holistically and in the entirety about what are your resources and what are the risks and what are the future emerging requirements going to be.
Maybe in way of a kind of a rebuttal there. Maybe it's not really a rebuttal. But is there, I guess to Gordon's point, so there's a lot of attention, at least when I think about 18F and USDS, around kind of what you were mentioning, human-centered design, customer experience, that kind of thing. From your perspective, does security sometimes seem like an afterthought with the types of, I guess, maybe custom work, or really whatever the kind of the approach that's going on within federal government? Is there kind of a need to improve, or a gap where it's that those things aren't necessarily in tension or at odds really, but they, in the same way that you have to have kind of a human first approach, human-centered design approach, you also have to have kind of a security first approach, if that makes any sense. Any thoughts there?
No, absolutely. I think it's not that Gordon and I disagreed. I think I may have used an inartful term of phrase. I agree 100% with his analysis of that. I will say, as someone, I started at 18F in 2015. The organization was pretty young. A lot of folks did not have extensive federal service and had not experienced the joy, the intricacies of the federal ATO process, shall we say, especially in the way that it manifested, honestly, very inconsistently across different federal agencies, and what that really meant. What did it mean to get an ATO in one cabinet level agency versus another, and versus a GSA, which is our home agency, and that was truly really different. And I wonder whether there was sort of new staffing, and it was a young organization, and as a result of that, perhaps in the very early era in which I was there, there was potentially less attention paid to the minutia of what does an ATO process entail. And I think, and as a procurement person, I think about this, what does it mean to staff a team to get a product from the build to the ATO process? I think we had program teams come to us when I was in government with trying to get something off the ground without the buy-in of their CIO shop, and we would sort of get them really excited about a potential solution that, for a variety of reasons, the the joy of FITARA meant that the CIO is a really key stakeholder in the acquisition process, and I think as the organization matured, and I think certainly today, the innovation shops really think about security as job zero, and they think about it in the broader and important requirement spectrum that sort of starts at the very beginning. I think perhaps, and I was certainly guilty of this, I did not I think appreciate the heterogeneity of the process. When you think about, like, it's in law and then you got the NIST standards, like, what are we doing? But the real fact of the matter is, like, the way an authority to operate is granted for a variety of cloud-based systems in government is truly, truly different basically everywhere you go. And it requires very different resources on the program to get that through. Sometimes the CIO shop just takes the whole thing and takes care of everything. Sometimes the program office gotta do most of the work, and sometimes it's a little bit of column A and B. And I think that um, that has, I think, been a learning, certainly since when I joined, that is very much thought of at the very beginning of projects now.
You have to consider, though, the industry went through this transformation, right? You're talking about it from the 2015 lens, but even COTS providers weren't putting security first, in the in the earlier days, right? So we've all evolved to this security first, model, and have to make it the forefront of everything we do, whether it's policy or not, right? Whether we're in federal government or we're external, security has to be the core of every product that gets delivered. Otherwise, we're victims of all the other things that could happen, and the threat is just different today than it has been, in the past around this space. So hopefully the whole industry is to evolve, just not just this singular process, if you will.
Yeah, but just to follow up on that point, and what Ala was saying as well, the unfortunate reality is that agencies are allowed their own interpretations of how they're going to implement FISMA guidance. And so that's one of the things, and Ala, I know you know this, that we've advocated for at ITI a lot, is in FISMA reform to really flip the script and say that agencies should assume reciprocity and have to demonstrate why they're not accepting reciprocity, and to do things to streamline the security processes so that it becomes easier. And really, this, Eric, is one of the hurdles for adopting COTS products a lot of the time. It sounds easy, or, hey, I can take advantage of all this work that GSA did or another agency did. But the reality is, if you're starting from scratch, the risk trade-off all of a sudden is different. And maybe you should just go, in that case, and build your own thing. At least that's the mentality that a lot of people end up still adopting, unfortunately. I think, again, there's unfortunately this compliance aspect to it that we need to fix with FISMA reform, among other things, to get agencies to really be challenging the decision to build for yourself or to do all of the security requirements again for yourself because you're different from the other department that did that work. I do think, Eric, that that's another point that we haven't touched on enough, and that is the responsibility of agency leadership to think through these costs as well, and to think through sort of the long-term implications, and to push back when somebody, and it's not that user-centered design is wrong, we absolutely need to understand user experience, but frequently the decision being made by one individual end user saying, I have to have this, doesn't rise to the level that the agency as a whole is going to say, this is actually critical for us to have. And they would rather, in the end, make a trade-off to say, we can change our process a little bit and use a commercial best-in-class product, rather than getting the 5% additional benefit we're going to get from that customization from what that end user needs. And I think, again, that's a place where leadership really needs to step up and to have an understanding of the mission and the technology and what are those trade-offs, and to make those at the highest possible level in the organization, which is challenging.
Yeah, I wonder, Gord, this is something we've talked about as well with, so thinking about the development of GOTS, so kind of government COTS and regular COTS, and I was wondering, as someone, as a former agency CIO, if you could share any perspective around, I guess, kind of the tension between the availability of COTS and GOTS platforms and going that route and all the benefits that come with it, but then also the trade-off around kind of CIO agency or kind of really them having some kind of innovation flex to be able to understand both from a program perspective and a technology perspective, what might be best suited. And, how is it possible for this tension between the cost savings with COTS or GOTS, but also CIOs still having some agency and some empowerment to be able to make good decisions around IT, given that there might be a lot of, push to go in a particular product or solution, in which case it seems like it's kind of out of their hands.
It is unfortunately frequently treated as out of the hands of the CIO shop or of IT leadership because the business or the mission says we need this, we have to do it now. And the result is the IT team feels like they're obligated to do that because that's what the mission said. Where I think agencies need to be going, where FITARA and other things are trying to take it, is to say that leadership decisions have to be inclusive of IT leadership in the organization, that it can't be the mission says this and technology says that. It's got to be collectively having a discussion about what are the priorities, what are the risks, where are we going to best serve the agency by developing something that's custom and unique, because there is a real differentiation in that from what we can get on a commercial best-in-class product in the market, or even a GOTS product. And where are the cases where there's a little bit of an advantage, but it's not enough to take into account these long-term downstream consequences. And so we're better off working with our organization to say, let's tweak the process a little bit. Let's change a little bit about the way we do it and use a commercial instance rather than customizing something. I think the other piece of it that agencies frequently struggle with, Eric, even when it comes to GOTS, is just the lack of control over that then, right? You're now dependent on another agency's timeline, another agency's investment, their prioritization. And so in a lot of the decision-making for a CIO and an agency, it's hard to differentiate between GOTS and a commercial product versus just a build yourself. So I don't know that really that level of depth of thought is going into that decision. It's really just a question of where does the control lie, where does the money lie, where is it being obligated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's particularly in considering if some efforts like login.gov and cloud.gov that we were talking about that are driven around GSA, and I think are on the one hand trying to work towards some of those things we were talking about, improving customer experience, streamlining, standardizing how customers interact with federal government, at the same time doing that in a secure way like login.gov. But that there's, again, it hits on kind of this tension between, so there is that cross-cutting kind of cross-collaborative effort to do something across all agencies, but at the same time, to what degree do CIOs have a say and it's like, is there, and maybe there's not I don't expect us to have an answer in a half an hour, but maybe is this something, any thoughts really on like, how do we, how do CIOs continue to be at the, have a seat at the table, and even with what I think a lot of people would say are good efforts to kind of have, certain standardized components around the federal government experience across multiple agencies that have widely different missions.
I think one thing, Eric, that CIOs can do to be effective there is to understand that they are working in this federated model, but that they can set standards. They can say to components within their department or within their agency, okay, you can choose to do some things yourself to have that freedom, but you have to comply with these standards in order to work on our enterprise networks, to leverage services that we can provide that take the burden off of you. So there are things, and successful CIOs are doing those things now. Again, it's sort of this degrees of freedom and risk trade-off that sometimes at a lower level, people are looking at, what do I need for myself right now? And that there needs to be higher level guidance sometimes to say, okay, we understand that, but that's not an acceptable risk trade-off for the organization as a whole. And you can only do that if you comply with these enterprise standards that we've set. And all agencies, I think, struggle with that very federated, diverse nature of their environment.
I'll pause for a second. I do kind of want to jump into, or kind of returning back to something Ollie you said around procurement. And I mean, it's IT procurement, federal government doesn't have the best reputation, obviously, but I'm wondering if any of y'all can speak to the kind of the challenge around, is it overprescribed? So talking about how this, you shouldn't necessarily go in expecting, maybe I want this COTS solution, or I know I need to build my own solution, but that really I need to be, I'm not, or at least in my experience, a lot of RFPs really have a set of requirements already. They're very prescribed. They're already kind of set. They think that this is what they want. Is that still kind of a problem within procurement where it's too restrictive right off the bat, and as a result, the procurement process isn't really lending itself to exploring that spectrum that we were talking about?
So I think, and I can mostly just speak to the federal space. State and local government contracting comes in all flavors, but I want to work off a theme that Gordon just brought up, and it's about really thinking about the risk trade-offs and then the risk acceptance versus sort of like mitigation, given that you cannot outsource your mission to anyone, and it is on the agency to deliver the things it is statutorily mandated to do. I think someone we have not yet brought up, Eric, until you just mentioned it, is the role of the acquisition workforce in the in the entire project, which is to say, from inception, from sort of appropriation of dollars, all the way to the operations and maintenance of something that's already been deployed. And the acquisition an acquisition representative is a key member of sort of the team that would work on something like this. And is it one of the first training classes that a federal contracting officer takes? I think it's called like FAC 100, and it's all about the cross-functional team. And I know, like, wow, two pizza teams or cross-functional teams is like a cool thing to talk about, but like, it's one of the only, it's the very first lesson that is taught to all contracting officers, sort of regardless of where they are in certainly federal civilian agencies. And the reason for that is because you cannot, program offices and other entities cannot throw requirements over a fence. That is not how sort of like risk works, nor is it how successful procurements are done. And I think, to Gordon's broader point about what does risk look like, what does standardization of practices look like, I think the most successful procurements I have seen are ones where the contracting staff, which is to say, in particular, the contracting officer, that's ultimately the warranted person who is legally authorized to obligate taxpayer money onto a contract, where that person really feels as though their equities are taken into account and they are brought along on the journey of what it is that is being built or bought. And even if it is a COTS product that may need customization, is perhaps there is a professional services component part of that contract, and making sure that the acquisition strategy is inclusive of whatever it is that the outcome needs to be, but then the acquisition professional and their risk tolerance is also considered, right? Contracting officers are one of the only individuals that can legally go to jail for the actions they take and on their job. A lot of other folks on a cross-functional procurement team, like, they make some bad calls, and I think it's important to be really sensitive to the broader risk tolerance of the acquisition workforce, who, and I know Gordon brought up the IT workforce. The acquisition workforce, overburdened, underworked, has not necessarily had the opportunity to have as much growth, and are overburdened in the pandemic with supplemental appropriations and having to get that money obligated onto contracts faster now than ever before. And I think having a tremendous amount of empathy for that workforce and really bringing them along so that they feel comfortable with all of the choices that are being made is really important. And I will just end by saying one thing, which is the FAR is really flexible. The FAR is a set of guidelines that explicitly says if it is not prohibited by the FAR, that means it can be done by the FAR. And I think about other I think about things that are explicitly authorized, such as other transaction authorities or broad agency announcements or commercial solutions openings that Congress has given in the last couple of decades to really try and nudge the contracting workforce and let them feel as though they have the agency and the legal authorization to think a little bit more creatively. But I really think that it's a team effort, and it requires this cross-functional team of security, design, program, to really not just make a decision of how to go about buying or building something, but to get it all the way through to deployment and then the operations and maintenance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with those points that Ala was making. And Eric, I'll add on one additional thing around the breadth of the FAR and the flexibility that does exist, and that needs to be taken advantage of by the workforce, who are undoubtedly overburdened. And we've all lived in one way or another the end of the fiscal year rush where everybody's saturated with. We've got 500 new requisitions we need to get out. Going back to your question though, start with an RFI. Right? Don't start with a fixed proposal with we need these 400 requirements or else. Start with an RFI. Understand what industry is capable of today. Understand what best in class is today. Figure out how that fits with what your needs are, and then move forward. And that's only going to happen when you have an effective acquisition team working with a technology team, working with a business team, working with the security team, and they're all working together, and they can make those determinations. But I have seen numerous examples where agencies have done that really well, and it's resulted in great outcomes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Sarah, you probably have some sense of really the effectiveness of RFIs, from kind of an industry point of view. Is that, I assume it's something kind of Dell's participated in at times.
So I'm quiet here only because I agree with everything that's being said. RFI is always the best place to start, but equally where we can, think broadly. As Ala said, there's so many things that have come out that allow us to be more flexible in our procurement. Look at commercial products that are already existing outside of the Fed space, and bring those into government, and think about their application. There's a lot of ways to look at this, so I totally agree with everything that's been said in this call.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm curious, Oliver. So I guess if thinking about like an RFI or like an ideal situation where we have cross-functional talent or perspective in really the early part of this process of like what kind of solution should we, what's this look like? What do we need? Is there a sense of collaboration with, like, does 18F and USDS, do they provide that kind of support around like, hey, this agency is thinking about going, developing an RFI, like is there a consulting kind of process for an 18F or a USDS to step in and say, like, you should really be asking these questions, and the RFI should be structured in such a way that you can get this kind of information? Because I think a lot of the times, depending on how the structure of the procurement or acquisition team, you don't know what you don't know, and it's sometimes it's nice to have that, or it's vital really to have that technical expertise. So is there is that something that we see with 18F and others?
So yeah, I'll answer that in two parts. One is GSA in the Federal Acquisition Service actually has a capability. It's a shared service that they've spun up, and it's market research as a service, right? Market research is one of the very first steps in the acquisition process, and I think in a world where to save time and in other aspects, folks have sort of recycled the same, again, 300-page requirements doc from 5 years ago. Sometimes that market research was not done. And to Suri's point, RFIs, Gordon's point about RFIs, are essential to meaningfully survey industry. And I think the most successful RFIs I've seen and sort of have participated in have certainly been the ones that have focused on outcomes and not the specific tactics, which is to say, like, we're an agency looking to explore an outcome for our end users that is this. Do you have some tech? Do you have some solutions? Come show us. I've also, and to that point, an RFI could be as simple as a Google form. I know GSA does a ton of those in their market research as a service, but also elsewhere. It's more like, do you have something? Can you show us some links? And then can you can you come in and show us? Can you do a demo? Can we get you in front of a group of folks and actually have you show us either a working COTS solution or a prototype, and can you demo it so that we're not just blindly clicking around on your website hoping to find the correct pages? And I will say GSA does a tremendous job of that. And in fact, I think the importance of RFIs and market research in commercial tech, which is moving super fast, right? To Suri's point earlier about how far the COTS community and government IT software vendors have come in the last 5-7 years has been really significant. And I think the continuous surveillance of the marketplace is really important, and it's a key part of the RFI process. And so I know that 18F, certainly during my time there, was really big on sort of the demos. I think we called it like demos, not decks, and it like you want to see. You want to see the potential solutions and see what industry has, and use that to inform outcomes. And then the second thing I will say is focusing on outcomes is really great in not just the market research, but also in the procurement itself, which is to say that there has been, I think, in the commercial IT world in the last several years, a sort of broad recognition that statements of objectives are better than statements of work for many kinds of projects. And I think those enable whatever vendor is selected to focus on getting the government to the outcome without really feeling beholden to like 38 pages of bulleted requirements with like where every button should be, and like where, if you like right click on something, what the next menu that pops up should be, right? Like that level of prescriptiveness can sometimes tie the hands of good practices, and certainly of good COTS outcomes or cloud-based solutions that may already be out there.
Sorry, I wonder if are there situations in which, or I guess also open to others, but where is there some kind of duty as a I guess a business partner to these agencies to kind of push back on any of this if you come across prescriptive RFIs or RFPs, like to what degree can, if any service providers are listening on the industry side, what is there a sense of kind of duty around, hey, like this is what you think you're asking for, here is like let's kind of take you this direction, like is that a conversation that is more comfortable that maybe business
I'll just tell you, as a leader of my organization, I encourage it. Look, it's not about being an employee of my business or another one. It's about being a citizen and doing the right thing for government.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're executing on a procurement in the wrong manner, and we're too closed-minded about what we're actually trying to achieve, to Ala's point, you're going through all this paperwork for the sense of this is what I need to do, not really thinking of what the art of the possible could be and how I could look at something differently, then yeah, of course. So I encourage all of my team members to look at everything and challenge it, right? There's some areas where, we'll see procurements and we'll automatically think, hey, this is something we want to chase, but we might not have the perfect solution for it. It's not an area necessarily for us. So we need to help steer the conversation and help government achieve their objective, not just executing on a pot of money because they have to get rid of it, right? So I love the conversation around 18F. I myself am trying to learn as much as I can, so I enjoy this discussion because I think there's a real opportunity to use this whole process to go evolve the way government is executing against technology objectives.
Yeah, the statement of objective is resonates
cool.
well. It's a great idea. Gordon, I had a question for you, and then I slipped my mind. But it was, I think it was kind of, I guess, by putting your agency CIO hat back on, and kind of thinking about this in terms of kind of market research, or really how do you keep a pulse on and around solutions and things that are out there while you're in many ways kind of buried and kind of keeping the trains running on time, keeping the lights on within your agency, but at the same time everything's, as I was saying, in the commercial side, IT, and generally it's just so fast. how do you keep your irons in both fires, kind of efficiently?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. And undoubtedly, most agency CIOs spend way too much of their time with the urgent crisis of the day, the email system being down or a security incident or whatever the case may be. The data in the CIO dashboard aren't perfect, but I think they generally show something like 80% of money goes to O&M. So, take that with a grain of salt, because I don't think the government does a great job of defining O&M anymore when you look at DevOps and Agile programs. But still, that's the huge, the lion's share of the resources and time and energy. I think, though, part of the answer was hinted at in what we've already talked about here, using some of these other tools which do exist. The broad agency announcement is a great sort of thing that you can do. You can do reverse industry days. You can do all sorts of things like that to be aware of what's happening out there in the world. Some of that is on CIOs and other technology leaders to make that effort as well. You can definitely put your head down and ignore all of that, or you can choose to go out there, to go to conferences and hear what's happening. That's been a little bit harder the last few years, unfortunately, but those opportunities are starting to come back. And CIOs, I would encourage them to take advantage of those things, to see what is out there. Something's going to light a spark in you to say, hey, that's a product that really is going to solve a problem for me. And you're only going to know about that by doing that sort of engagement. So some of that is CIOs and other leaders really making that effort. Some of it is using the tools like I'll mention that the FAR allows, and making sure that the procurement staff and technology program managers are empowered to do those things, that you have, like we've already talked about, an outcome focus, and you tell people, figure out what the right approach is going to be to get there, rather than a laundry list of requirements. And encourage your team, empower your team to do that work, rather than like I said, just jumping to a conclusion.
Yeah, it makes sense. And something that while you were talking just popped into my mind was kind of the effort around Challenge.gov. So this is kind of another way to access information or products, or and really kind of open a door to maybe particularly given how there are some there's some restrictions around who can kind of engage in federal contracting, and Challenge.gov seems like it's one way to kind of identify maybe other potential businesses or service providers. Is there and some of these are from GSA and some of these are from the agencies themselves, but I'm curious if there's a sense, or if any of you have a sense of how that information is disseminated once it's kind of completed. So so GSA may have like an AI challenge or something like that. I think they have one that's active right now. And maybe there's a winner, and all that is like, it's kind of what's the next step really. And that's great. It's it's an access, it's providing, there's a prize, there's prize money. It's all that sounds really cool, but like, what are the kind of the next steps in terms of, that disseminating kind of that information or that product really amongst the wider landscape of COTS and custom stuff?
Yeah, unfortunately, Eric, today there's something of a valley of death. You build a prototype or you acquire some new information, and how do you actually see that through to real products that are really delivered to the enterprise? And we've created, I think, some good silos where pieces of that work are done in the piloting and prototyping and gathering information. And we've got to do a better job collectively, both on industry and in government, of ensuring that those things are integrated into the enterprise decision-making processes, and that information gets incorporated into an RFI, into an RFP, into real things that are going to go to the enterprise, and that the work that a small company might have put in through Challenge.gov or any of the other mechanisms that exist out there for innovation, that doesn't go to waste. That's something where the government needs to figure out how to do that better today.
And couldn't agree more. Building off of that, I have personally never done a challenge in my career, but I worked really closely with the PMO that runs the Challenge.gov platform. And I think one of the things that always really impressed me was like the research lab at a public university that would ultimately win something because it's like a team of 3 graduate students that got really excited about solving a problem. And when I think about the spectrum of folks that want to help make government better, which is really ultimately what this is about, right? Is like, how do you help government achieve the mission and how to use different contracting tools to do that? I was always very excited about what it meant, and lowering the barrier of entry enough so that a couple of grad students could feel empowered to not just submit a proposal, but get selected and get whatever the prize money was and the prestige it lent to the university. And it was always really exciting. I think Gordon's point about the Valley of Death and the independent software vendor community, the ISVs, a lot of them are cloud native. A lot of them are doing such wonderful work, but like the journey from winning like a phase one SBIR, a small business grant, to being a prime contractor, particularly for some of the large weapon systems contracts, is very significant, right? Like the spectrum and the maturity of a company through that can take a really long time to do, and not all companies have the funding or the ability to sort of withstand something like that. So it's certainly really doable. But the thing that I think is really exciting about the challenge.govs and like some of the SBIR work. I know that NASA SBIR is just like doing some of the coolest stuff out there, is that it really allows a bunch of folks to dabble in what it means in helping the government. And I think that when I think about the macro sort of like national security and broadly helping the government do its work, as many Americans as can get engaged in something like that, I think is the better from just like a policy outcome perspective.
Yeah, I spoke to a software manager at a federal agency last week, and he was kind of floating the idea of this, of IT shops within federal government having kind of discretionary innovation funds, and I'm curious to get y'all's thoughts on that. Like, is there, and this is in a larger context of Gordon, you know, I've talked about this before with the Technology Modernization Fund, and really some challenges that federal IT faces in acquiring funding for really anything. So, and of course, both the TMF and working capital funds, you'd have to pay those back. Those are kind of revolving funds. But is there room for, or a strong case to be made for like R&D type of either maybe more robust outside of federal government, as I was saying, around universities, but also maybe even internal kind of innovation funds that are, and also how do you can make the political point that these have a lot of value? I mean, historically, you can point to a ton of things in the 20th century that were, as a result of that kind of investment. But what are y'all's thoughts on kind of an agency innovation fund and like really giving IT leaders some like money to play around with to really kind of break that O&M technical debt, kind of stuck in the mud situation there right now?
I don't know that I have an answer. I do have a comment though on it, right? I think I tend to, whenever I have this conversation, I tend to end up with, we don't have the skill, capability internally within the agency to think about ideas that we want to innovate against. So there's absolutely a skills gap that exists. And if you have these innovator funds, you have these sort of next gen opportunities, how are we going to implement them if we can't think beyond our four walls? And the talent within our own internal organization isn't skilled up enough to be able to think in that manner. So I always end up in a conversation that gets stuck because, we don't know where to go with this innovator fund because we're not innovating at the moment.
Yeah, I would from the agency side. I think it's unfortunately, Eric, a similar situation a lot of the time. There's so many competing priorities within the agency, and they can point to, here's an outcome that this money is going to go to now, regardless of what it is. And it's challenging to justify in many agencies where your budgetary constraints are so severe. We want to put some money into something and it's a risk. We don't know what the return is going to be. We might get a great idea that transforms something the agency does, and we might have spent some money and we learned that it doesn't work. And that is a hard thing for a lot of agency financial officers and others to support, given all the other competing priorities that they've got. There are places where it's done, of course, in the defense side, the intelligence community side, they're able to preserve a little bit more and have a little bit more of a long-term focus. But in the civilian agencies, it's really difficult. And then the other piece of it, Eric, like we talked about in the past, in the context of TMF or working capital funds, is anytime you do something like that, you're constraining the the financial staff in the agency and reducing the other things that they can do. So that inherently is a source of resistance to the idea of setting aside money for innovation. I had to, in my former job, work really hard to protect one small team with one very small budget to say that they should be doing innovation. And that was a constant battle every budget cycle about why were we doing it.
And to toot Gordon's horn on that, one of the most important ways that this can happen is with top cover, right? We haven't yet talked about the importance of sort of political and agency leadership in encouraging this, but I think to the extent that we've had our conversation so far around broadly thinking about risk in the acquisition process and the time to market and the time to mission delivery, the time to ATO, um, the the ability and the sort of support of high level leadership at the agency in order to do that is really essential because there's only so many times that someone can raise their hand and come up with an innovative idea only to be shut down before they sort of stop suggesting different perspectives. And so I think that to the extent that there are action items for folks that may be leaders inside agencies is really thinking about encouraging that innovation in whatever path it ends up taking, whether it's a challenge or an OTA or just reusing an ATO from another agency through the FedRAMP process. There's encouraging reciprocity there and reusing system security plans, whatever it is. I think that there are having the buy-in of leadership to think about things differently is really important.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I was gonna say, maybe I'll just give each of you a minute or so, really on this topic, or really kind of broadly federal IT modernization, but in particular, I guess maybe on the procurement, acquisition, buy build side. Just last thoughts, comments. What's important if you could change one thing, or if you'd like to see something happen in the next 5 years. The floor is yours. You can really swing for the fences. Suri, maybe we'll start with you.
Look, it's a journey, right? And it feels like sometimes
Yep, I think we lost you. Sorry.
Oh, I hit a button there. Sorry. So, all I could say is it's a journey, right? We go back and forth on build versus buy and all these different procurement models. Ultimately, technology is changing everything that we do. And so we have to figure out how to incorporate it into our daily lives, into everything we do from a mission aspect. And of course, security and the threat landscape changes. Ultimately, the more flexible we can be around the requirements that we have and the conversations we have, the more opportunity I think we have for government to evolve and to ultimately drive real change across the enterprise. So I look forward to keep having that conversation.
Thanks, Paula.
Sure. So all of that, plus wanting all of that. And then I've been thinking a lot about workforce and in particular the acquisition workforce. I know I've brought it up already once today, but um, these are the only folks that can statutorily obligate money. And there's been a fair amount of spending. And if we want really great outcomes, we need not just an acquisition officer core that is really thinking about compliance, but we need one that are more comfortable with risk and who can build a culture of innovation. And so I think personally what I'd love is filling that open head count and getting more COs onboarded into government.
I'm going to go with workforce also, and not just what Ala said, although that is 100% true and is something that we need to continually be keeping track of because it's too easy to lose sight of. You hired a few new contract officers and we're good. No, you got to keep training them. You got to keep them up to speed with where technology is going. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it, I think for me, Eric, goes back to something I was hinting at the very beginning, and that's the importance of agencies understanding that technology is fundamental to their mission. And big risk decisions and big mission decisions have to be made with the CIO, with other technology leaders at the table who can ensure consistency in the way those decisions are made. At the top levels in most agencies, there's too much turnover too quickly on the business side, on the mission side. frequently there's more continuity in the technology side, and that's got to be leveraged to really say, this is strategically what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is why these technology choices, buying this, building that, makes sense. And let's stick with that and invest in that. And that's something where, unfortunately, I think today, too many agencies don't think of their technologists as core to the mission.
Well said. That takes us to right about time. I really appreciate the three of you joining. As expected, I learned a lot, so hopefully the audience did as well. Yeah, just appreciate your time. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having us, Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks.